Alright everybody, here I am again. This is part 2. Right now what I'm doing is drilling and tapping the old push-in oil gallery plugs for threaded setups. Let me show you. I just got done taking these 5/8 soft plugs out, and when I'm done cleaning all this out, I'm going to remove these again and seal them. Right now they're just well, they're in there snug, but I have this one here I had to shave the back side of so it didn't intrude into that oil passage. This one I left alone because it seats perfectly. These two up here, it didn't matter as much. They just needed to be threaded in. So I'm going to clean up all my chips and shavings. I'm going to give this block one real good clean. And then here off camera, I'm going to go ahead and put the cam bearings in. And then I'll see you guys here in just a minute when I'm getting ready to slam everything together on here. Alright. So I'm sure this would be so much better if I had a cam bearing install tool that wasn't just a small block Chevy only. Would have got in the one right now. But I'm going to make it work. So I found a magic combination of things that's going to get the rear 3 in because they're the same size, and then the larger ones can be put in with the small block Chevy tool. But I have to build up. As you see, I'm at the perfect spot. I just test fitted the bearing. It fits nice and smooth over this. This is going to go down inside. The cam bearing tool is going to hit it inside there, and then I'm going to smack it in. So should be good to go. But right now there is no cam bearing tool in the area that is available, and I'm not waiting because I have got to get this engine back together. So I'm gonna go put this in right now. Alright, so I've got this all set up. I'm gonna use this hammer on the end of this as I'm steadying with my hand to just guide it in so it doesn't bounce back out. As you can see, I've already started to drive it in. And back here, I marked where the oil hole was on the socket, so I could line it up with the oil gallery hole that it needed to line up with. So I'm going to put you up here on the tripod, and you can watch me drive this one in. Right about there is where I'm going to stop. I want to make sure when I pull this all back out that that hole is in alignment. Right now it's flush with the block on the inside, and I have plenty of room for the cam bearing cap on the back of the block. So that one should be in place. And for the most part, the only thing I'm going to do is repeat the process through all of these till I get to the end. And then I can slide the camshaft in, and then we can put the crank in, and I can put the pistons and the rods in, and this engine's going to be going together. Alright, so before I go any further with this, while I had the camera off, I went ahead and checked the cam fitment in the new cam bearings, and they did in fact need a cutting tool run through them. And because I don't have that, I had the next best thing, which was the old camshaft. And what you can do is every single one of these journals gets a little cut made in it, roughly 1/8 of an inch deep. You can use wheel bearing grease in there, or you can use assembly lube. I like assembly lube. It's a little thinner, Gives me a little bit better feel for the metal building up in there. And then what you do is you run it down through there slowly while this is standing up. That's why that tire was there. I just set it in there so it was standing straight up and down. And you use the weight of the camshaft itself and a wrench on the bolt on the end of it, and you turn it by hand. That way you can feel when it grabs and you can stop. And you kind of lift back up on the camshaft, because you don't want to go too fast, too much too fast. And you want to let it just fall into the block. And then you give it you can take it out, clean it, re-grease it, stick it back in there, give it a few more turns. It should turn very smoothly. At that point you should just be able to grab it with your fingers and spin it in the bearings. At that point you can then pull it back out. You're going to clean everything again, because you just made metal shavings one more time through the entire engine, which is why we haven't buttoned up any of the holes yet. There also may be a little bit of a drilling process going on here to match the big 5/8 pickup for the V6. I'm just going to do a slight taper right there, clean it up with a little sanding roll just to get the hole out to the right size for the pickup, so everything's nice and smooth, so there's no big wall for the oil to hit right there. But right now, the next step of assembling this, and it's time for the dry fit. We're going to go ahead and put the bearings in to both the block and the main caps. And then we're going to start taking oil clearances of the bearings, because we need to get down to 002 on both the crank mains and rods. So I'm going to get you back on the stand, and I'm going to start plopping bearings back in here. Alright, now take note of where the thrust bearing is, because the thrust bearing is this one. This is the biggest main, and the crank rides up against both sides of this back and forth. And there may be a need to play with the spacing here. With these new bearings, I may have to shave them down just a little bit to get the crank end play right back and forth, but we'll see when this is all assembled. Right now, the important part is that you have all the bearing shells that have the holes in them. Let me grab one of the ones that do not. These are the ones that go in the main caps. The ones that go in the caps have no grooves, have no holes. So they're the bottom half of the bearing shell. The top halves are the ones that have the oil grooves and the oil holes, and those are the ones that go in the block. Let me put this one back. Now what you want to do when you're assembling these, obviously I just dropped this one in there and it's nowhere near right because it's not even facing the right way. Every one of these has a tab on the end of it, and the tab always goes into here. And I like to start them there. So let me set these other bearings down real quick so I'm not dropping them on the floor. These are hard to get right now. And what I do is I start right here at the edge, and then I just kind of roll them in there, press them in with my hands. And you could be able to feel with your hands, because your hands are delicate tools and they are a very precision instrument. When you pay attention, you will be able to feel when this is below the surface and you have it pressed in there all the way. And what we're going to do is we're going to go through every one of these real quick and install them. I'm going to do the same on the main caps, and then we need to bring the main caps over here, put them in with the crank dry, then torque everything down. And the reason for that is the plastic gauge, because I do not have proper measuring tools here at the moment that are precise enough to take the oil clearances without the crank in here. We're going to do it the old school way with the plastic gauge, and that smashes out when it's torqued. And then there's a gauge on the paper, and then I have to match the gauge on the paper. Well, let me grab one here real quick just to demonstrate. This is a tiny, tiny little piece of plastic, really. And then there's a gauge on the side. And what I'm looking for is a tighter tolerance. Let's see if I can find the tolerance I'm looking for. Yeah, this particular one doesn't go down small enough. This goes 0.25. I need 0.02. So I've got to grab my other one, which I think is over here. Let's see. That's not the blue one. I can't find it. At any rate, what I'm looking for is a nice tight tolerance based on the gauge. And it has to be a dry thing, so I have to dry fit it. I have to torque everything, and then before I put it down, which I'll show you, I'm gonna put a little strip of plastic gauge across these when I torque them. And then when I untorque them, that plastic gauge will not move, and then I can just lay the gauge paper next to it, and the widest point is my oil clearance. And that'll be good enough, as long as it's tight enough. So I'm gonna roll the rest of these bearings in here. Now what you may end up doing, as I said, I'm still not done cleaning this engine out because I want to make sure every little nook and, well, see, look, there's a piece right there. Every nook and cranny of this thing still has stuff in it, so I got to be very careful. Move the engine out of frame on you guys. And this is the same process for any engine. Some engines like the Buick just happen to have some extra steps involved in making sure that oil clearances and things are precise. And that's because they weren't precise from the factory. In a very bad way. And just so you can see, it's the same process for the main caps. You push it in and you make sure that it's down below the surface. And when you're installing your caps, note there is typically an arrow that marks towards the front of the engine. Before you take your engine apart, however, if you do not have anything that denotes towards the front of the engine on your main caps, mark them some way, somehow, scribe, paint marker, something. Which direction they came out of, so you can put them back in the same order and in the right direction, because it does matter. You see, as this one is backwards. Okay, so the other thing you want to do under the bearing before you put these in is make sure everything's clean, because anything that is on the back side of the bearing transfers to the front of the bearing. So right now, imagine the crank was in here. These bolts are all clean, threads are all down. I would run these in and torque them down, and then I'll check my clearances. So I put all the bearings in, everything is in order. I'm getting ready to bring the clean crank over here and lay it in, and then I can show you how that works. Something to take note of, now this doesn't hold true for all cranks, but the vast majority of them, if you wanted to check them real quick to see if they are cracked anywhere, you just simply touch them to the ground lightly and they ring like a bell. Okay? If this was cracked, it would sound more like when I picked it up. It wouldn't ring at all. So, just something that you could do real quick at home to kind of give you a visual if you didn't have the time to have somebody magnaflux it, which you should, but it's an old school trick for checking for cracked cranks. Okay, as you can see, I've got the crank in here, and I have these all sitting in here, and you see this tiny little piece of plastic right here. That's the plastic gauge. Let me zoom you in there so you can see it. Here we go. Okay, so what we're looking for is when that smashes out, we are going to be looking for, come on, focus. Probably not going to focus. At any rate, we're going to be looking for an 020, or the 002 on here, which is that green mark right above my fingernail. And when that smashes out after I torque it down, it should be as wide as that and no wider. If it's wider than that, or if it's wider than that right there, get it on camera, what I can do is I can move all but the thrust bearing, obviously. I can move these bearing shell halves around and see if I can get, like if I have one that's tighter in a spot, I'll zoom you back out. So if I have, say, one here that's tighter and one here that's looser, I can switch the bearing shells, or at least the half, and then check it again. And sometimes that's enough to even it out. And you're not switching the main cap, you're just switching the bearing shell. The bearing shells are all kinds of different thicknesses most of the time. They're within a certain tolerance, and tolerances stack up. So even if everything seems like it's fine and it measures okay, sometimes it'll stack a little tight, or sometimes it'll stack a little loose, and it's okay to move those bearing shells around because they don't technically have a home except for here. The thrust bearing has to have, it's only one, well, I should say it doesn't have to have, it is the only spot it can go in right now. What I normally do when I'm getting ready to assemble these is, again, everything needs to be dry. You want to come straight down. You don't want to try and wiggle it back and forth because you'll move the plastic gauge. So you want to try and come straight down, give it a little pressure, and then I come in here with a little soft based or a little dead blow hammer, and just give it a little tap. Just tap it down into place. It doesn't have to be real hard. You're just tapping lightly until it's seated down, and then these will go in fine. There we go. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these out, and I've gotten myself a little thing of a little paint can lid, and I've got just motor oil in there. That's just 1030. I'm going to take just a little tiny bit. Okay. That's going to run through the threads on its way down, and it'll give me a proper torque spec. So I'm going to go ahead and do that to the rest of these. And in the meantime, while I'm torquing these down, I'm going to get this camera on the charger. That way I can bring you back for when I check the plastic gauge. Alright, so I've already gotten one done here. Let me move the camera around. And I'll zoom it in just a little bit there so you can see this plastic gauge. Okay, see how it's smashed out? This one, much to my surprise, ended up being a little tighter than 002. So you see it's a little fatter than the gauge. So I went down here to 001 just to make sure, and at the widest portion, which is right here, it's still not 001. It falls in at 0015. So I'm a little tight, but that still falls in acceptable range for a performance Buick. But I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to check the rest of these just to be sure. Oh, other way. I'm going to go check the rest of these just to be sure, and then once I am satisfied with all of my measurements, provided none of these need to move, I'm okay with polishing this just a little bit to get my clearance looser if I need it to. I may find one over here is 0025, and I can take that bearing shell half and switch it with this one and then recheck those two, and it should come further into spec. Because I want it really tight, but I don't want it so tight that it's just going to build heat, kill bearings. So I'm going to go ahead and check the rest of these. Alright, so what I've ended up with, surprisingly enough, is tight. It's tight. It's perfect all the way across. So there will not be any need to move bearing shells around because it's awesome. So I'm going to repeat the same process with the connecting rods on each journal. So I don't need to film that. Let me gloss over something here real quick while I have you on the camera, and I have a piston over here ready to go in the engine. Now the reason why I'm skipping the step of showing you how to set ring gap on these in this particular video is because there's no gap to set. These rings have already been in this engine for a little while. I can't handily get a 30 over piston ring, and these were not in there for any length of time. They're practically new. So whenever this engine got rebuilt, it was years ago, but it was right before it got parked. And you can see, I didn't really even clean that up. So I'm just going to, I gave them a little bit of a glaze break on the cylinder bores, and these should reseat. They've got plenty of spring in them. You want to make sure that your rings have tension. Typically what you would do is before you assemble the engine, this is part of the pre-assembly, you would take all your new rings, except for your oil rings. You don't really need to check the spec on those. As long as they're springy, they're going to seal. But your top two combustion rings have to have a set gap. That gap closes up, and the hotter the engine gets, the more that gap closes up. And in a performance situation, you want to have this gap a little on the wide side, but for the most part, you're just going to put these together as spec'd. After you check the gap to make sure the gap is fine. And the way you do that is before you put it on the piston ring, you put this in the bore. You take the ring and you stick it down inside the cylinder bore it's going in. And you take your piston and you push the ring down to about the oil control ring area. And that'll let you make the ring straight inside the bore, and it'll push it down far enough where it's in an area where you should be measuring it. And then you'll take a feeler gauge and you'll check the inside of that gap. As long as it's okay, it's ready to go on the piston. If it's a little tight, then you have to file the inside of these. When you do file rings, you want to make sure you don't leave a burr on the outside edge, because that'll catch your cylinder wall and then scratch it, and then you might as well not have rings in there. So these have already, like I said, these have already been in the engine. They've got a few miles on them. They are still within spec. Everything measures fine. And I did tediously take the rings off of these and check them earlier before I started to get to here, and then tediously put them back on these rings, or put them back on these pistons. So not going anywhere. I'm going to line them up where they should be and then slam them home. But the next thing is to check the rod journals. And again, it's just much of the same. I'm going to bolt them on there. I'm going to check the plastic gauge, and if it's within spec, yeah, it's good to go. So the next step will be assembly of the engine. Now that we've done with pre-assembly, I will tomorrow be getting on. After I've cleaned this all up, I'll be getting you guys back on the camera, and then we'll be going through this one step at a time, put this engine together, and we should be pretty well ready to fire it up. Hopefully, let's see, what is today? Monday? So we'll be looking at tomorrow is assembly. So Wednesday this should be ready. If not ready to start, it will be ready to start. Whether we start it or not will be a different thing. We may end up sticking it in a bag until I get the transmission ready, and I got to get that starter yet and make sure that starter is going to fit. And then I may just throw the exhaust manifolds on it and fire it up where it sits. Who knows? But at any rate, that's coming up soon, where we fire it up and break it in. I still got to get a pickup tube. I still got to finish that oil pan real quick. So there's a couple things I'm going to do off camera before you guys get back to me. Alright. So, assembly tomorrow. And ready for fire up. I told you this is going to move fast. Likely I'll have, even if the video is going to be put out the following day, I may even have this thing ready this evening. Who knows? But I'll still get it on camera. You guys keep that shiny side up.